Good evening. It is wonderful to see so many people here. This is a testimony to the attraction of Professor Mark Lilla. We're going to have a conversation for about an hour. Let me situate this in relation to the overall discussion that we've initiated last night. Many of you were here last night. I see gluttons for punishment returning, which I'm delighted about. This whole series, which will go on through 2017, is an attempt by the CEU community, led by me, to rethink what open society means. What do these words mean? They've been part of our mission, and I, as an incoming president, believe in the ideas that they incarnate, that is, free minds, free politics, free institutions. But like all slogans, like all mission statements, it's one of those things that kind of goes onto the library shelf, you know what I mean? And it becomes something we refer to, but doesn't activate, doesn't drive us, doesn't change our teaching, doesn't get into the soul of an institution. And so my thought was that if we could have a year's discussion about this and really knock this idea around, and knock it around in a very new historical context. I think we're all aware that we're living in new times. We are not living in the historical period from 1989, perhaps to the accession of Hungary to the European Union, that period of transition. We are in another period. We are not in the period of transition. We're in a new historical period in Central and Eastern Europe, in Western Europe in general, and in the world in general. And so we need to situate these values of open society within the context of a new historical experience. And Mark Lilla is a wonderful interlocutor to take this discussion forward from where we were last night. Mark, as you know, is a professor at Columbia. Before that, he was at the Committee on Social Thought in the University of Chicago. Many of you will have read his contributions to the New Republic, to the New York Review of Books, more recently to the New York Times, in which he did a piece on the end of the politics of identity, which was the most read op-ed in the New York Times in 2016. That's something. It has, as he said to me over lunch, changed his life. Occasionally an academic will write a piece like that that defines the conversation thereafter, and this has happened to this guy, lucky man. And so we'll be talking about that tonight. He is the author of The Reckless Mind, Intellectuals in Politics, The Stillborn God, Religion, Politics in the Modern West, and most recently, The Shipwrecked Mind on Political Reaction. So let's welcome our guest, Mark Lilla. Thank you so much for being here.
It's good to be here. Thank you very much.
I'm going to do something slightly odd, but don't be put off by it. At certain points, I'm going to press the button and put quotations from Mark's work up on the board. This is a heuristic device just to give you a sense of how he's arguing and to provide the pretext from which questions and comments that I have will be launched. So that may be happening. But let me start by asking you to think about open society as a problematic, just to connect what we were doing last night. Open society is the product of that unique post-war moment, 1945. Karl Popper, Isaiah Berlin, J.L. Tallman, I could add Friedrich Hayek, Hannah Arendt, all trying to think about the challenges that liberal democracy faces coming out of fascism, war, and the totalitarian challenge from Russia. An open society is born in that moment. Is it done, Mark? Is it over? Is this an idea that was of its moment, but in your view has lost its pertinence? If you were to criticize it, what would you say, Mark?
Well, I think the first thing to be considered, two things to be considered. One is the potentially oxymoronic nature of the phrase, open society. Societies, since time immemorial, have been closed things. That's what makes them a society. There's a border there, right? And that border can be more or less permeable, but unless you hold to the idea that there's a world society, in which case there's no society, the notion sort of pushes the limit of what a society can do, or actually what it doesn't have to do, thinking that it can operate without doing what societies have done to maintain themselves and reproduce themselves historically. Connected with that thought, though, I think, is that before we can consider whether its time is over, we need to think a little bit about the way in which it was a product of its time. That those who were the proponents of the open society idea were themselves not brought up in what they considered to be open societies, or not in a historical moment where they were dominant. And it's it's in the nature, there are moments in intellectual history when there are leaps or changes, right? And there are important figures that change the way we think and establish how a certain way of thinking ought to be continued. And one thing they never do is think about how they themselves were produced by a society or kind of thinking that was not what they're proposing. In other words, they often don't reproduce themselves, because what made them were many of the things that they want to leave behind. So Marx would not have been Marx had he not written his thesis on Democritus and Epicurus. That was not meant to be part of communist education, however, right? And I think there are ways in which the prophets of the open society, given their experience and the historical experience of the two wars, of the Shoah, the creation of Israel, and the rise and then collapse of fascism, thought partially and thought idealistically about freedom and openness, but did not think hard enough about what it would mean to reproduce a society of people who wanted an open society. And I don't think that open societies naturally produce people who are devoted to an open society. If those are their only principles, something else has to go on. A supplement is necessary. And I think we're in a historical moment now where we see when certain principles of liberty and individualism are pushed to their extreme, we end up producing people who themselves are not devoted to an open society or certain other institutions or norms or customs that silently support such a society.